Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for dialing in. We'll wait a couple more minutes for everyone to dial in. Hope everyone's having a great Sunday. Thank you. Took a lot to get ready. A lot of coffee was involved. Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. We'll give it another moment and then we will go ahead and get started. Hi, Kansas City. Okay, well, let's go ahead and get started. Hi, everyone. My name is Phoenix Ablaze, and welcome to the Tiki Oasis monthly series focusing on subjects of history, appropriation versus appreciation of cultures, minority cultures, Tiki culture, mid-century Americana. The goal of this series is to provide a forum for education, knowledge, and conversation. Through this series, we invite marginalized groups to amplify their voices, to share their knowledge and experiences. We invite advocates and allies to ask questions, and we invite all to contribute to the broader discussion on diversity, inclusion, representation, and equality in the Tiki community. As we dive into our monthly series, there are many topics to unpack, discuss, understand, that are part of the current Tiki culture. And for our first topic in this monthly series, we put the spotlight on the image of the Alluring Island Maiden, prevalent in many Tiki bars, art, books, menus, and more. Thank you in advance, the president and head distiller of Privateer Rum, Maggie Campbell, for being our moderator. The topic for today is Sensual Paradise, Deconstructing the Romanticization of the Alluring Island Maiden. This roundtable conversation will explore the image of the exotic Polynesian wahine from South Seas pop culture to Tiki style and beyond. From cinematic hula girls, black velvet paintings, menu art, tattoos, and exotic entertainers, the image of the island girl has had many iterations, some innocuous, some stereotypical, but still a historic iconography of our beloved mid-century Tiki culture. Throughout the conversation, please put your questions in the chat or in the Q&A section. Thank you, Maggie, for joining us as our moderator today. Please welcome Maggie.
Hey, everyone. Thank you so much for joining me today. And thank you, Tiki Oasis, for encouraging this conversation, making space to bring visibility to underrepresented voices in a lot of our discussions, and also just creating an environment where we can have a speak up, speak out culture where we sort of grapple with some of these subjects and engage in community with each other. And thank you everyone for joining us today. It's really important that we all work to diversify our feeds and hear different voices and internalize other perspectives and make time and space to hear opinions from the very people most impacted by some of our work. So there's a Q&A. Feel free to drop questions there. I'll be watching for it, and we're reserving some time at the end to make sure we address them. I want to thank every single one of our panelists for being here and giving us this incredibly generous offering. And we really want to be very respectful of their time and energy and not exhaust them or weather them. So if you are following up with any of our panelists after the show, please use a consent-based approach and ask them if they have time and space to engage with you as well. So thank you again for your voices and being here today and trusting this space to share your perspective. And we're gonna kick off this conversation with a little bit of like a level set. We'll set the stage for what it is we're discussing, under what parameters, and in which ways. So yeah, this discussion will inherently focus on the mid-century era of Tiki. sort of the glory of the nuclear family, which is always kind of a little bit of a violent term itself, right? Nuclear age. The nuclear family, this really important time where post-World War II, the GI Bill meant a lot of access to higher education for free, of course, explicitly towards certain groups, the most benefited being sort of white men who had served in the military, but also people of color who had served in the military as well. We saw a really huge economic boom, and Americans were beginning to live these more stylish and more design-centered lifestyles. And we start to see, gorgeous furniture and artwork that really express this time. This time is also fraught with a lot of complications. I know one of our panelists today, their parents couldn't have even been legally married in this era. There are certain issues of race and class and gender and sexuality that all intersect in this era that we romanticize for some of the positives, but also we want to address some of the negatives as well. We'll also be using the word tiki today, and tiki in terms of mid-century culture, but we also want to respect that the word tiki belongs to, Oceania, Polynesian, Pacifica culture, and has very serious meaning as well. So we want to make sure when we're using these two different terms, hopefully there's context to understand in which way we're addressing it. But we will hold both of those ideas at once as we begin to discuss these subjects. I think it's important for us to recognize that we like to say things are better than ever today, but in truth, they're not. The middle class was booming with people of color in the 60s and 70s, but in the 80s and beyond, a number of recessions have inherently burdened and harmed those communities at a disproportionate rate to a lot of white communities. The housing market bubble in 2006 absolutely targeted brown and black families, causing far more harm to those communities. And this has taken a really big toll on opportunities and advancement. I know as a member of the queer community, I've seen great advances for my community as well, and also recently a lot of erosion. We like to think it's always the best it's ever been, but we are actually dealing with a time it's incredibly complicated and layered. So accessibility is an issue we absolutely want to address. As mentioned, I'm Maggie Campbell, president and head distiller of Privateer Rum. My pronouns are she and her. I am a queer, bi, cis white woman, and I also do a show called Treacherous Waters with Ashton Berry about relationships between white women and black women. I'm also on the board of Resistance Served, which is an annual conference that works to increase the awareness and visibility of contributions and works of brown and black people in the hospitality community. So today's talk is not a checklist on how to wash your hands and make sure you're not guilty and keep your hands clean. It's not going to say, follow this rule, and then you're a good person. It's going to be grappling and working with and talking through some of these feelings and experiences that we all have. So absolutely, we're going to talk about the difference, I'm sure, as we go on about intention and impact. We may intend not to hurt someone's feelings, but if we do hurt their feelings, that is the impact that we've had. We might not intend to accidentally set a wildfire, but if we do, we are still responsible for the damage we do. So I'm sure those themes will come up in the intention of the Tiki community, as well as potential harms done that we might not be as aware of. You're not required to be here, although you are valued and we're very welcoming. If this is not for you, you're welcome to leave, but we hope that we can make this a really good vibe, positive, open place to be able to discuss these things and reduce any potential and unrecognized harm we might be doing to each other. If you ever get like a tight feeling in your chest throughout this talk today, recognize like that's the edge of change. That resistance is sometimes the moment where we need to stop and say, what's the worst that I could happen if I just listen, and kind of open myself up to listening rather than resisting. Defensiveness and that pitch we all get, it's often from a place of fear, of being afraid of just listening. We're just going to open our hearts and minds, and we're also going to make sure that we are very conscientious and aware of trying to do the best we can to care for each other. A lot of this discussion will talk about who should be centered in these discussions. Not all people of color are the same, nor experience the same issues, challenges, problems, struggles. I think that's really important for us to recognize there's going to be a lot of intersections here today of differing identities and differing experiences, and thinking about who is it we should be centering in this discussion on certain topics will be something we're all asking ourselves as we go throughout our continued relationship to Tiki over time. And all of our experiences and our understanding and what we think is okay is not inherently true for other people. Assuming that we have opinions or know what's best for other people is a place of privilege. Assuming that we understand and they misunderstand and they don't get it is assuming we're superior and assuming their psychology. So we're going to try to just be really curious today, guys, and kind of keep our eyes open. And I'm really, really excited to have these underrepresented voices brought to the forefront. I think this is something really important that's happening in our industry. I've seen some really beautiful talks happening. I saw Mary Palick join, who led a gorgeous talk on rum and the rum community just a few weeks ago. I think we've got some great things happening. And yeah, we really do want to make sure that we're reducing harm, engaging in the community, and really engaging in relationships instead of just trying to be right. And if we leave the seminar today and just throw out a few tiki mugs, and that's all we do, then we've missed the point. So hopefully today we'll engage, question, work. Maybe we do need to throw out some tiki mugs. Maybe we don't. That's step one. It's not the end of the road. So without further ado, I'd love to bring our panelists into the discussion. As we do that, I'll share, I was just a few months in the before times, before all of this began to happen. I was actually in a tiki-themed Chinese restaurant, and I began to look around, and I saw how there were some caricatures and some, Fu Manchu mugs and things like this. And I happened to be there with someone of Chinese descent, and I asked them, does this hit you in a certain way? And them sharing that they trusted me to share their feelings, that it was really harmful and it felt like a caricature, really gave me an example of how, a Chinese restaurant can be really respectful and cool and awesome, and how it can be harmful and hurtful. And I think today we're going to talk a lot about Tiki, how there's respect, there's disrespect, and how to play in and among it. So thank you guys all for joining me. Mariah, would you mind kicking us off and sharing your identity, your pronouns, and why you feel so passionate about this topic?
Sure. Hello, everyone. My name is Mariah Kunkel. My pronouns are she, her, hers. Identify as a Black and Indigenous Chamorro cisgendered bisexual woman. And for me, why I'm so passionate about this discussion and discussions like these is because it draws upon my own personal experience and desire to make these hospitality environments feel a little bit more hospitable and actually confront some of the issues that you touched upon in your wonderful introduction, Maggie.
Thank you so much. I really, really appreciate it. Would you share any experience you have in hospitality or the bar community as well?
Sure. I've been in the spirits industry for the past 7 years, primarily on the branding and marketing side. Most recently served as the brand development director for Bona's Mezcal Artisanal. I'm also one of the co-founders, along with Samuel Jimenez, of Pacifica Project, which is a hospitality, tourism, and spirits focused organization focused on promoting and highlighting Pacifica voices within the industry.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Lindsay Rubin McNichol, would you mind sharing a little bit about your experience? I find your story really, really inspiring. And I've also got to see some videos of you and your mother, and it was just very touching. Would you share a little bit about your identity, what brought you to this discussion, what you find passionate about it, and your role sort of in this world? I'm going to ask you to unmute real quick. Sorry.
Okay, can you hear me now? Okay, thank you for inviting me to be on the panel. My name is Lindsay McNichol, and I'm the founder of Heva San Diego and Reva Tahiti Productions. Usually Heva San Diego happens right around this week in live. It's a Tahitian festival, and we have a Tahitian dance competition, Tahitian food. We try our best to basically bring Tahiti to San Diego, and it's kind of evolved into an international community because it's not only for Tahitians. There's tons of people who just are very passionate about the culture. So that has kind of been what I've been dedicated to for the past 10 years. And Tiki Oasis usually happens around the same time. So it's kind of tough for us to go to each other's events, but it's great to see that you guys are evolving and adapting, even though we're on the, everybody's confined. I'm very passionate about this because I have always thought the women's body is beautiful, and I am not afraid to show skin. I know there's two types of thought processes in the Polynesian community when it comes to Polynesian dance. There are those who think that sometimes we show too much skin when we have our traditional costumes on, and then there are those who think that the body is beautiful and that you need to accent it. So um, I think that I'm a very free person when it comes to the costumes and traditions. Um, and it's different to see the different perspectives that we have here in America, and how sometimes we have to be very careful, especially when you're organizing a dance competition and you have these beautiful women in these beautiful costumes. So that's kind of my perspective.
Yeah, I appreciate you sharing that awareness of safety and also some of the discussions around it. I always like to joke that any problem with violence or objectification about women is never really anything that women are doing. So I support you in wearing the costumes you want to wear. So
Yeah.
I don't think we're the problem. Marina, would you like to introduce yourself as well, your identity, what brings you to this forum, what passions you share in this space?
Hello. Thank you so much. It's a privilege to be here with such amazing and strong women. I'm totally bowled over. My name is Medusirena. It's actually a name that my mom came up with. She used to call me Medusa because my hair was, well, there you go. And the sirena is the mermaid, so that's kind of the combination of the two. However, I was born in Vieques and raised in Puerto Rico, where there was a very large tourist industry. My parents had a lot of visitors from the mainland coming in, and it was kind of part of our lifestyle was to have people coming in from elsewhere. They would be very intrigued with our little culture, you know, with the rainforest and our lineage and such. But I never really got to celebrate it a whole lot, you know, other than living the life. And once we moved to the mainland, for financial reasons, because there was a bit of a, much like you'd explained previously, we had to experience some problems on our little colony based on what had happened back in the 80s, early 80s. We wound up having to move the family up north to the mainland and trying to adapt to an entirely different life where people perceived me differently because of the way I looked or because I spoke differently and such. I found it to be a challenge at first, but then I learned that maybe there was just a genuine intrigue, and I tried to kind of ride that wave a little bit. And I also had a great love for other cultures, knowing that they were experiencing parallels of it, maybe not identical, but parallels nonetheless. So I began to rather bond with different groups. And I was very, very fortunate to, when I was very young, still on the island, I bonded with some Moroccan women where I learned belly dancing from them, Middle Eastern dancing. And when I came to the United States, I studied Middle Eastern dancing initially. And then a wonderful Polynesian woman by the name of Wailana Waiwaiole took me under her wing and taught me basic hula, Tahitian. She taught me pretty much the basics of a Polynesian show. And I started doing a show in Daytona Beach way back in 1987. And 1997, excuse me. And from that moment on, I really wanted to dedicate myself specifically to it so that I would be as true to the culture as possible. So I was very careful at anything I did. I would ask the kumu, is this appropriate? Is this appropriate? And it continued to progress. But while I progressed as a dancer, I did start to see things, you know, the perception of the dancer. And all I knew was my little changing room, my little show, the kumu telling me to do this specific thing and how to express this in the most sincere way. But then I started to see the other aspects. And I found that intriguing because to me, it was another culture in my head, another subculture that I was just admiring and looking at. Like I had my own, I was practicing with a different one. And on top of that, I'm watching a third one, like parallel universes all the way. So I always feel like I'm more of a spectator in the entire gamut. And then when the Tiki explosion occurred, which was several years back, I was particularly intrigued because for the first time, there was a group of people that were watching us perform, and not, from my personal experience, those folks really seemed to enjoy it rather than just feel like we were doing it as they're eating their poo-poo platters and we're just kind of there as a background. They were the first group of folks that I remember really paying attention. And it made me feel rather proud to have studied as much as I did. And so I had that good taste of it. I do understand that as things become more popular and larger, that's when it starts to kind of go astray. You know, tree has many branches.
We're always the ones who like fuck up a good thing, right?
It's always, I think it's just so, it's with a population. I mean, you can have, out of 10 people, one person's nuts, all right, but what about 100 people? What about 1,000 people? It just gets higher and higher, this amount. So now of course, we're noticing it even more because it's a larger population of people that have that mentality or that perception. So now it's hard not to notice it and have to address it. So I'm looking forward to helping in any way possible to attain that in any way I can. It's kind of hard to explain, but
I think you're doing it very good justice. That we'll get into it. Tiki is the intersection of a lot of cultures. You know, you having your experience in Puerto Rico, Caribbean drinks, and Filipino bartenders and performers from all over the world. It is a very complicated mix. And we'll talk about the, you know, cultural melting pot versus running roughshod over other communities to extract elements of value for profit. You know, it's sort of like, you know, when you have your cool upstart artist community, but then it gets turned into big business. When does that hand begin to take over and it becomes a raw material, like intelligence capital, cultural capital created by one community but extracted for profit from another? And where does this all meet? We're going to get into all of it. So Chalky.
I started doing swimming. I'm sorry, I just wanted to say this real quick. I started doing the swim shows, even though I've been swimming my entire life and doing shows and underwater work. The swim shows enabled me to separate from it, and that becomes its own culture. So it's all concocted when you're doing a mermaid show. So that's a little bit of a different.
Yeah. I so appreciate like looking in on your feed and the world you've created. Mermaid school, I think it's amazing. All right, so Chalky Tom, one of my favorite people in the industry. I'm probably, full disclosure, the person I know most on this panel. Would you share a little bit about your identity and what brings you to this talk today and how you interact with Tiki in your life?
Hey, my name is Chalky Tom. I identify as Pomo Indian from California and Walker River Paiute from Nevada. We're best known for the ghost dance. My family is also just regular American and Georgian as well. And my pronouns are she, her, or if you're from California, dude, or if you're my husband, comrade. I am originally from Los Angeles, and I'm currently living in New York, which is Lenape land. And I am the co-founder of Doom Tiki, which is a doom metal themed tiki pop-up that focuses on non-appropriation, creating a experiential, you know, cocktail experience that also separates from using any iconography, sexually exploitive imagery. And we go the full satanic because it's kind of funny and very cheeky and kind of a nice FU to people that have reappropriated people's religious iconography. My father, Daniel Tom, was a leader and an organizer in Los Angeles for the indigenous community. And my mom, Rosemary Lee, who's on this call actually, or on the Zoom, she's an anthropologist and ESL teacher. So I was always raised with like a lot of cultures, a lot of discussions, and with a lot of very strong indigenous women and women from like all over that are BIPOC to kind of like, you know, that taught me to be proud of who I am and to speak up and to find and create community and create awareness. And that's just kind of been my MO ever since. And then Mariah, who's also on this, She's one of my Pacifica friends and allies, and she's been a very big part of, you know, helping me find the organizations that we like to benefit for Doom Tiki. So one of the main components of the fundraising aspect is that we find different communities that are dealing with the long-term effects of colonization, because colonization isn't a single act. It's a continuous process, and it has many facets. And there are still issues in all of these communities that have been disrupted and stolen from and appropriated from. And I would like to create awareness of this, as well as find ways to utilize my connections within the liquor industry and other like organizations to come up with this funding. I'm also the brand ambassador for Ming River Baijiu, and I've been working on a fun program for them using a traditional Chinese spirit and creating tiki style cocktails as a way to tell the story of how American Chinese cuisine and tiki were integrated, and how as a means of survival, especially when people like white families moved to the suburbs, diversity wasn't really a thing, it was escape. So in order to survive, a lot of these restaurants had to adapt to these, you know, type of environments and sell like cocktails in grotesque mugs of themselves. So it's really been a mission of mine while I've been doing this project for my work to find a way to kind of balance all of it and teach people through drinks.
Thank you so much for sharing that. And that brings us to, I love it, thanks. Doom Tiki is one of my favorite things. My Doom Tiki mug is one of my most cherished Tiki mugs, a satanic cat, and I love that. It's just, like you said, all this iconography that gets borrowed from all these other communities turning out on its head to be against the accepted grain has been really interesting to watch you work with. Angelica, would you give us an intro to your identity, what excites you about Tiki, and what brings you to this talk today?
Hi, thank you for having me, and thank you to all the panelists who are part of this discussion today. So my name is Angelica, and I write a blog called Resident Modernist. I am a writer. That's what I do for a living, and I love language. I am of Mexican descent. I guess I should say, I was born in Mexico City to Mexican parents. I immigrated here with my parents when I was 4, and lived in Texas for about 34 years before moving to Los Angeles. I actually discovered Tiki in Dallas at the old Trader Vic's, and then kind of started getting involved in it a little bit. Very difficult to do out there because you're very landlocked out, and there's not really a whole lot to experience. What brings me to this is I approach this from a consumer standpoint. So I definitely believe in making good choices in with respect to what you consume. That's something that my mother instilled in me, is obviously you want to be aware of, you know, how cultures are represented, because goodness knows in Texas there's so many representations of my own. And I'm very, very proud that my mom brought me up to kind of look at everything with a very critical eye.
Great, thank you so much. And I'm glad we have your voice here from the consumer end. I think that's an important one to address. You know, I think that obviously as like a leader of a business, like I understand the responsibility really lies with leadership to make the right choices. I think putting a lot of the onus on consumers to like handle disaster capitalism or vote with their dollar, it's kind of mixed around from the people who are, you know, the ones creating the raw material and extracting most of the wealth from it. So I really like to hold leadership accountable, but I love having the consumer voice talk about how you see and view and grapple and deal with the many, many versions of Tiki you see out there. And I think Marina, in your introduction, you did a really great job of sharing, you know, there's a lot going on here. And I think one of the things that we like to do, particularly from my culture being brought up on continental North America, is good people do good things and bad people do bad things. And if you do one bad thing, you're a bad person. And if you do a good thing, then you're a good person and you could never do anything bad. And I think we need to throw all of that away. I think that we can understand in today's day and age, you might be a great filmmaker, and that has nothing to do with encoding your DNA magically to make sure you could never harm a woman, right? Like those two things are very different things. People are many things at once. We can hold many things at once. And I think that we can talk about, Chalky mentioned the really important contribution of Chinese American cuisine and what an important, immigrant restaurant success story. Growing up in LA, I absolutely saw the importance and contributions of Filipino bartenders. Obviously, the cocktails are Caribbean. And so we get this weird mishmash of all of these different things drawn together, but particularly when it comes to imagery today, talking about the hula girl, the South Seas image of the woman from the islands, I think that we can say that the iconography is obviously drawn a lot from sort of these tropical ideals. And obviously this can impact every single person on this seminar very differently. It touches all our lives. But I think one of the things we're going to talk about a lot today is sort of how people might feel like we're being a little overly aware of some of these foundational elements, but I always see these as rocks in the foundation of a much taller pyramid, that at the top of that pyramid are things we don't want to see happen. So how does our everyday contribution, how does a image of a scantily clad brown girl who's underaged on, a tiki mug end up potentially, being connected to the rampant disappearing of Indigenous women? If you're not aware of that in the US, this is a very, very serious issue. The safety and security of Indigenous women is really, really at risk. And so we might not think those two things are connected, but how do our everyday exchanges sort of create this permissive society for these very unsavory things to escalate and escalate and escalate? There's the pyramid of, indifference turns into minimization. So indifference might be, avoiding a confrontation because you don't want to like get mad at your family at a holiday. Minimization, letting a joke slide, saying, oh, maybe I misunderstood, denial of any intersectionality. And then that can kind of grow into this veiled racism, racist jokes, tone policing. This is where we see a lot of cultural appropriation. And of course, if that's allowed and encouraged to grow, that can turn into discrimination, which we see in our society is like mass incarceration, slurs, segregation, like school funding, all this housing segregation, and then funding schools by only local taxes creates these situations where it just feeds into itself. And then of course that escalates into calls to violence, and then genocide. And I do, while we have this talk, want to stop and recognize that particularly American Indians right now are very much experiencing what many people would call a genocide with COVID. There's a lot of forced policies going on right now is really affecting that community and causing a very large loss of life and increased pain and suffering. And I just want to name that as something that is happening in the world at this moment. So I'm going to turn it over to Mariah first. Do you want to talk about a little bit about explicitly addressing the mid-century motif of the hula girl or the island woman? What are some of the ways you're grappling and dealing with and identifying and talking about how complicated and loaded that issue is? What do you see, and what would you like to not see?
For me, the mid-century hula girl, island maiden, Pacific Muse, all of these images have a direct sort of, you can draw a direct line from these representations to colonial expansion in the region, and the first contact with Western European forces coming in contact with these indigenous cultures that they had no sort of sense of like bearing or context as to what they were encountering, bringing with them Enlightenment philosophies, ideas about savagery, ideas that were also born out of colonialism in other regions, such as the Americas, such as Africa, such as the Orient. And then you see the direct application onto these women that they encountered after being at sea for months and months and months, scantily clad in a region, doing cultural sort of protocols and having cultural regalia that didn't seem to make sense or reconcile with their idea of what a woman was or what culture was about. So all of this baggage that they brought with them to the region transformed the sexuality of the Pacific woman, transformed sort of sexual roles and even sexuality to a huge degree, into reducing these women, these indigenous women who in theology, in understanding of sexual relationships, Pacific women had a lot of power. Pacific women were deities. There were matrilineal societies that existed in many different island regions. And so to me, the mid-century hula girl has her roots in this, an imagery that was born from sex work, then is transformed through a lens of colonialism and imperialism, which happens later, and then sort of speaks to notions of securing power, securing dominance over a region, which is translated through female bodies, because you're creating a new race through, you know, heterosexual copulation with these women. You are controlling, if you control the land, you control the bodies as well. And to me, because these women, these representations of women, and these are, you know, growing up, I'm seeing these images being not of the dominant culture. You're always searching for representations, messages. What am I? I understand what my family is telling me that I am, what my culture is. I have a strong understanding of that, but what is the main, you know, dominant media culture messaging and telling me about how they value me, how they see me? So the Pacific woman, the hula girl, she's always pretty fair-skinned, which is not an accurate representation of women from the region. We have Black and brown-skinned, beautiful women that come from the Pacific region. We're not always young. We're not always fair-skinned. We're not always, you know, available sexually for whoever's, you know, desire that might want to come along and take it. So for me, I mean, I definitely went through a period where I sort of had to unpack what I felt about myself, my sexuality, my identity as a woman in relation to this fantasy, which this fantasy is told from the point of view of an outsider. What's missing from this narrative about the hula girl, the South Seas maiden, is actually their voices. They've been completely silenced, and we're being told what it is that we represent. And to me, when I would, you know, go into these tiki bars and see the black velvet paintings, always naked, always, you know, very sort of passive, always sort of pleasing, subservient, usually carrying something or serving something. Like, what does that tell me about myself? And also, how does it impact these disappearing cultures in the region when we're telling women of the region that this is what you're supposed to conform to, and if you don't, then you're wrong, or you're bad, or you're ugly, or you're not desirable. And for me, also, just, you know, trying to move past these narrow stereotypes, move past, you know, these representations is something, because I'd love to see a return to the power that, you know, these cultures, our cultures in the region had, and see more of a full-fledged woman. In the mid-century, you had a lot of anxiety about, you know, incorporating this, primarily Hawaii, because for America, Hawaii is sort of like short code for Oceania, which is not appropriate because the region is one of the most culturally diverse regions in the world. You had a lot of anxiety about, you know, brown and black people sort of becoming the majority in this state that they were incorporating into the United States. So, you know, presenting Hawaii as embodied by this pleasing, passive, smiling, subservient sort of figure, you know, smoothed over a lot of the colonial violence, a lot of the situations that Kanaka Maoli were facing in the region, and also on other colonies as well. So for me, what I'd like to see is a return to that power. I'd like to see, you know, sort of a celebration of, you know, older women, which I think is instilled in our own cultures within our own communities, but understanding that this sort of like symbol that you're holding up is very narrow, and it seeks to sort of restrict and confine Pacifica women.
Yeah, that sense, like, I definitely recognize you as someone who's very pro sensuality, very
Yeah.
pro having your own
Yeah.
sexual expressions. And it's not, that is not the problem. The
No.
consumption of these people as an object to be consumed. I mean,
And
you think
possessed.
about, yeah,
Yeah.
and possessed. And like you said, I think even with the discussion of the song WAP right now, the idea that
Yeah.
it's uncomfortable for women to have their own strong embodied sexuality, because a lot of our systems are meant to weaponize sexuality against women, and
Right.
that is not how it works for them. So
Right.
they're very fearful of these types of reaction. Lindsay, you had mentioned, as someone who, talking of the hula girl, obviously what you do is very, very different. Would you talk a little bit about your experience with sort of the like caricaturization of this 50s hula girl, and how that impacts your work and your life and your identity?
Yeah, definitely. Part of the what I do is I kind of study the trends of Pacific Islander dancing. That's mostly hula and Tahitian, and a lot of these groups that form, focusing on teaching the culture and the dance. Um, they have all evolved over time, and one of the powerhouses was Nona Sina, and Nona Sina they kind of started mid century, just with the evolution of the Tiki girl. And I want to say that they were extremely successful, and I want to say it's because that trend started. I think it had an influence. People were very aware of Polynesian culture because of that. So I don't want to say that I'm 100% against it, just because I think that for every action there's a reaction, and that kind of um, excited people to see hula girls and Tahitian dancers perform. Um, so I think because of that, I think a lot of the dance groups they started to evolve, and Nonasine was created, and then all these other groups started popping up out of nowhere, and there was success. And then they started getting more rooted into the culture and bringing more details out. And it wasn't just about the show. Then they started extracting the actual culture in it and trying to share that. And that's when people started just so passionate about it. And that's where I kind of stepped in, because I recognized that we're missing, we were definitely missing that teaching cultural part in it. Because before it was just about show. It was about Las Vegas shows, birthday parties, weddings, just the entertainment aspect. But I think nowadays it's kind of evolved in a whole new direction where people are actually curious about the culture. But the woman's body, when I look back on the Tahitian culture, I think Tahitians were extremely open with their sexuality. We had chiefs, and Tahiti was usually run by a queen. It wasn't until it was run by, because all the queens had kind of died off, and then a king took over Tahiti, and that's when he lost Tahiti to in a gambling. So it was always run by very strong and dominant queens. So I want to say that Tahitian women were fairly strong and open with their sexuality. And then the missionaries came. And when the missionaries came, that's kind of when everything changed and everything was turned into a savage. Even taking baths and going in the water, surfing, tattoos, everything that was cultural was basically turned into a kind of something savage. And there was a period in Tahiti where they started to lose stuff, but they didn't lose their dance. And that's kind of what revived everything over time. Uh, and when some time passed and they got back to the roots and they brought back everything, and the missionaries were kind of turned away, then the sexuality kind of came back. And you had artists like Paul Gauguin. And there's a lot of people who disagree with the images that he did, because they're topless women, they're Tahitian, just like some people might disagree with the tiki girl image. But at the same time, it made people dream about Polynesia, and there was a sense of reality to it, I think, in what he was painting, because really Tahitians were very sensual. Even me, when I was a child, I was used to seeing girls on the beach topless. I was used to seeing somebody feeding their child with their breast open. Sexuality, it just wasn't a big thing. And there was a sense of freedom, and there's something very natural about the woman's body in Tahiti. And so when I was growing up, going to Tahiti was definitely different for me than being in America. I turned into a different person when I was in Tahiti. Everything was very natural, open. Women weren't wearing tons of makeup because they couldn't. They would just come off them even if they tried. It was just so hot out there. But they were just a sense of very natural embodiment with the woman's body. Come back to America, I noticed that even if we try to depict Tahiti's culture and the sensuality and just aspects of the Tahitian life, there will always be some type of comment that kind of says it's almost inappropriate, whether it's something that has to do with the costumes or cultural aspects like giving birth, because these are all some things that play into the dance. Because usually when you do a dance, you mimic life, and it's an art form almost. So I noticed that whenever groups were starting to play more into the culture, then we started to get negative comments from people that weren't necessarily part of the culture, but just spectators. Usually, to be honest, usually there were men who were saying it's inappropriate, this isn't good for the family, but at the same time, this is the culture. So I am very supportive to sensuality. If a woman wants to do something with her body, if she wants to show her skin, or if she wants to reenact things that happen in real life and tradition, I think that's great. It's amazing, and this is reality. I don't think we should try to shame it or try to hide it. And I think whenever we're looking for aspects that are wrong with the culture or wrong with showing the true facade of it, I think that's when there's an actual problem with the society.
Yeah. Yeah, I really appreciate you sharing that. I think, especially like your such personal experiences, being there and being here, and I think it really hits at a lot of the heart of what I think we'll grapple with today, where I think a lot of the cultures that Tiki borrows and appropriates from are not the problem. It's definitely the way in which it's wielded by other people, like you said, with these respectability politics and American beliefs over the top, depicting it as savage or saying it's inappropriate. It's like the image that cannot have any charge there comes here, and we, like as continental North Americans culturally, we charge it with all of this stuff we're projecting onto it because it's not ours. And I think that's where we get into a lot of struggles. I really appreciated how you discussed missionary culture. The missionary's downfall is one of my favorite drinks. I always call it the meowtionary's downfall, like a cat's meow. Chaki, I know you and I talk a lot about the impact of missions, missionary enslavement, and actually how it shaped a lot of our drinking and alcohol culture in the beginning. I'm gonna ask you to speak on like whatever it is that's speaking to you in this discussion right now as an Indigenous American who also does a lot of this work to represent a way to decolonize Tiki. So what are you thinking and feeling during this discussion?
Well, a lot of times I reach out with women from other Indigenous communities. I have friends that are Pacifica, I have friends that are Maori, I have even friends that are Filipina, and a lot of the times we have these discussions on like perception and things like that. And, you know, we were matriarchal, and it wasn't until like the missionaries came that we learned shame and sexual exploitation. And I think one thing, if we're going to discuss colonization and imperialism, is that sexual violence is a weapon that's used in a lot of this. And it doesn't stop with there are harmful consequences of portraying people in a way that's without their consent and through a colonial viewpoint. You know, if I want to share my culture and my regalia and how things work for us, I wanted to be on my terms. And, you know, like there were all of these like problematic, like historical things that like the dusky maiden trope, the noble savage, and then the whole romanticized, you know, woman that kind of offshoots, like at sometimes Pocahontas is considered that, or I believe in Mexico, it's Malinche. So there are all of these sort of like romanticized notions of these women leaving and rescuing these colonizer men. And, you know, they're kind of seen as traitors, but you know, there's also like an element of exploitation to that. But one of the more interesting things is, especially growing up in Southern California, where there is a lot of Pacifica community, and there's a very big Indigenous community, is how as communities, we work together. One of the things that I always refer to is the Chumash that are from the Southern California area, and the Native Hawaiians would come to California, and they would have dolphin dances as this cultural exchange with a story about a rainbow, an island, and dolphins. I'll have to like look it up, you know, because I haven't thought about it in a while, but it was always really interesting to see like men from my community, women from my community, like teaching each other these dances and things like that. And then like one of the things that always resonated me with it as a kid is like meeting other like kids, you know, and just having these discussions. And some of them were interesting, like the Hawaiian kids that my dad was friends with, their parents, they'd be like, yeah, so like, I guess it was cool to be like an Indian in the 70s and everyone wanted to dress like you, but in the 80s, it's cool to be Hawaiian now. So, you know, people kind of care about us again. And it's like a really weird awareness and a really weird conversation to have when you're like 7 and 8. But, you know, my main thing is I try to avoid using these things just because I don't feel comfortable with it. And it's not my place, even if I am BIPOC, to use these images for profit and use them in a way that's exploitative without actually, you know, talking to people about it. And like I said in my Punch article, don't be an asshole. If you feel like something's problematic, don't do it. You know, like people are not monoliths, and for their cultures, one person isn't going to give you all the answers. But if you listen to enough people, you can start to draw conclusions on what's good and what's not. So, you know, especially being from Southern California, where fantasy is created, you know, where everything's about escaping, even though you're in a beautiful place, you know, what's the best way to put this? Even growing up around like all of that, you know, I think one of the most problematic elements is taking things from people and ignoring the people. That itself is sort of an act of violence. And that's just kind of my thoughts. And part of the reason I'm on this conversation is because in the conversations that I have with other women, there are issues of MMIW in all of these other communities. Because if you only show women as something that's readily available and exotic and down for whatever on your terms, you know, that does lead to direct violence. That does lead to sexual exploitation. That does lead to child sex trafficking in a way that you're not going to have, you know, if these people were not marginalized and exploited in the first place.
Yeah. Yeah. I think I like how you call out that as someone who is not a member of that community and not likely to experience the negative effects in the same way, we have to discuss like who is being centered here. How do those become foundational stones for this pyramid of harm? And I really appreciate you sharing all of that. I think it's really, really valuable. And, you know.
Well, yeah. I think the most important though thing is, if we are all BIPOC, if we are supportive of each other, then people will listen to us, because a lot of us have been saying these things for a long time. And even if it's not your culture and you feel a certain way about it, it's not always your place to make those decisions and make those calls.
Yeah, I so appreciate that. I think for me as a like a young white woman, I was definitely told to react incredibly strongly. I was very groomed, as all white women in our society are, to react very strongly. And how dare you tell me I don't get to do something? And I inherently get access to that. And how dare I be denied the right to do what I want when I want? And particularly at the intersection where, you know, what's limiting me from, you know, to upper levels of privilege is simply my gender, you can feel oppressed while still enacting that same exact oppression out on people who intersect below you. And that same entitlement, and I get to do what I want. And that same, how dare you tell me that I don't get to do every single thing I want. We can enact those same systems of power out on women who intersect below us. And if anyone's not aware, BIPOC or BIPOC, which I know we've all used in shorthand, refers to Black and Indigenous people of color. And it explicitly calls out that within continental North America and the culture we're having this discussion now, Black and Indigenous communities intersected a lot shared a lot and also experienced some of the highest rates and most severe consequences of our culture and our society and the way it's run now. So if you guys hear that term, that's just framing for what that is. Marina, I would love for you to share. I think you brought up some really great aspects of, you know, all of the different cultural mesh. And I think one of the defenses we hear a lot is that, you know, Tiki isn't meant to be, so Tiki as in mid-century Tiki culture isn't meant to be this accurate representation of these other groups. And I hear that and I respect that. And we understand the long and wound history, but obviously it impacts all these different communities in a very real way. Like, sure, maybe it's not supposed to be the most accurate portrayal, but where does that then create harm? For you in your work, you sound like you've had this really enriched, you know, multi-experiential experience. Would you share a little bit about how you're hearing this conversation and how that hits you? And I'll ask you to unmute real quick.
Not too sharp with that one yet. Sorry. Generally, as a performer, all I think about is the perception of the audience at any given point. And you can even see that in something as simple as a performance done on a stage rather than done on the floor at eye level. If you do a beautiful dance on stage, there's something honorific about that. And it's set up in a way that allows the people who watch to see it from a different perspective. That is higher. And I find that I get a better reception when I perform from that perspective. If you are doing a quickie little show at a quickie little party and you're in the midst of all those folks, you're at their level. And for some reason, maybe that makes it seem like you're more approachable, but that's when those bonds are broken and it makes it a little bit easier for people to feel free enough to say something a little bit maybe inappropriate in those situations, especially if they've been imbibing and things like that. And maybe they are saying those things when you're on stage, but there's still some sort of a difference, like a wall, a barrier between what you're doing and what they're doing that allows them to see it in a theatrical setting and perhaps see it as an art rather than as a novelty. But it's very difficult to differentiate that depending on the scenario. You know, some restaurants really will place great emphasis on the fiction and the colors and the, I hate to say it, I'm going to throw that word out there, the kitsch aspect of it, because it's that kind of escapism they're seeking. Other places are absolutely beautifully preserved areas where you're looking at it and going, my goodness, this is fabulous. And then you'll see a woman dancing on a stage and you go, this is a fantastic cultural experience. But I think because it's an easier and a quicker fix in a lot of situations to get something, you know, low budget, you know, low to the ground. Costumes aren't, you know, there isn't a lot of accuracy involved in the costumes. You just want to entertain the people for a little while. When enough of those performances take place and not enough of the culturally rich ones, you know, compensate for it, then people are going to start siding more with the lighter side. And it's very difficult to stick to your guns and say, you know, I've lost many jobs. Many people will ask me to do something specific and I'll go, I'm not going to perform at a men's club, or I'm not going to perform at this party. I'm not, you know, or I will certainly never do kahiko, you know, in a situation, you know, without a kumu or somebody to supervise. They don't know those rules. And it's not a bad, I'm not going to be angry at them for not knowing. They just need to know. If I tell them and explain it and they get angry and hang up on me, then so be it. But if they understand and then we try to think of a way to go around it, you know, let's negotiate, let's compromise. Maybe we both can benefit from it in some way. But it's always really difficult, especially when things become as popular as they have and they've gotten diluted in that popularity.
Yeah. Yeah. And I love and appreciate how much of your work you do. It seems a lot of like cosplay and a lot of just like, do you not like that word? Is that?
It's a contemporary term. It's
okay. You do a lot of costume work and like, you do a lot of things in a lot of different ways, like werewolves and horror. And I love it because it, for you, you know, mermaids it is very easy for you to be creating this like other world, this transporting experience that's not, like you said, while you're still grappling and dealing with like, in what ways am I okay? How am I doing this? I think we've seen on, you know, a million Tiki forums. We've all been in Tiki forum hell. We've also probably all been in Tiki forum heaven sometimes too, but also in hell, where it's like someone is going 50 rounds about how do they make this drink not offensive. But it's like, if you have to go 50 rounds, just make a different drink. And I think that spoke to what Chalky said about like, you can just like not do that. You could literally do like anything else. You could call that drink any other name in the world. Maybe it doesn't have to be that one. And we bite like a dog on a bone and won't let go. And it's like, maybe you could just like not do that. That'd be cool. So I really love how you're engaging and grappling and saying, you know, this is where my boundaries are, and this is how I honor and respect it. And like you said, you have so much experience and have learned so much from so many traditions, and bringing it together in a respectful way rather than a harmful one. And I think that's a lot of what we're talking about. And finding those boundaries is work for a lot of people.
It certainly is. And even in the swimming community, I focus on the art of swimming, the underwater art of swimming. That has also branched out in many different directions. So there are people that are into the outfits, and there are people that are into the makeup, and I'm Esther Williams Underwater, another group, another culture in my own head. It's my climate. And I try to stick with it. Even though I expand, I still try to explain that all of it comes from this particular thing. If it weren't for Annette Kellerman, there wouldn't be Esther, there wouldn't be all these other things that eventually lead to this product that you see behind the porthole. But it also applies, even knowing the history behind a specific dance, hearing it from your instructor, you know, feeling when you know that you're going on stage that you're representing hundreds of years and generations, and you want to do the best you possibly can. And I always think in my head, there's one person in that audience who's watching who is that I'm representing. So I'm going to work exceedingly hard to make sure that they're addressed. And they're the ones, you know, even if they're invisible, they're the ones that I'm doing it for. But it's not everybody feels that way. And I appreciate all different perspectives of it. But I'm just grateful to even be able to embody that even for a slight moment.
Very cool. Very cool. And then Angelica, do you want to share a little bit about how do you think, you know, the next generation of Tiki and, you know, consumers of this sort of Tiki culture, how do you think a lot of them are like entering the scene, and what do you see a lot of excitement around?
Sorry about that. I had trouble finding the cursor there. You know, I've always been very surprised pleasantly by the amount of truly compassionate and caring people that make up the Polynesian pop or Tiki community. And I think many of them are able to kind of look at it with a very with a more critical eye than perhaps people in the mid-century did. I don't really feel like, you know, with respect to the hula girl, when she was, you know, kind of when the imagery was kind of in its heyday, I don't really feel like perhaps people really stopped to consider, you know, what kind of characterizations they were consuming. And the way that I kind of picked up on that is in my experience as a Mexican woman. Our society is very patriarchal. It's, you know, and I felt like when I'm looking at the characterizations, I kind of use my own experience to mirror that. If I see imagery that kind of is very sexist, inaccurate, I don't consume it. And I think a lot of people kind of feel the same way, you know, if that's the kind of mindset that they go for. I think it's really important as consumers to think critically, to, you know, consider another person's experience. I also, and I think Marina and I talked about this before, the whole exotic, the term exotic is also something else that I deeply struggle with, because I, I feel like more often than not in my personal experience, I get told, "Oh, you look so exotic." And I'm like, really? But what does that mean? That to me is just sort of a microaggression for you telling me that that I'm basically a foreigner. Thanks very much for pointing that out.
And it's
I don't,
also like coded language for like a little bit of projection of like exotic, I think, is a way to like hyper objectify and in that kind of way, and sort of separate that, not extending that humanity to you. It's like, oh,
Mhm.
you're exotic, you're another thing.
Yeah. And I think that when you use it to describe a person, in particular, it can be pretty harmful. Now, not saying that everyone's going to react to that term the same way, but I know that just in my personal experience, I don't enjoy being subjected to this game of where exactly are you from? It's, and I think that, many women probably share that experience as well. So again, as a consumer, I think about these things, when I choose what to consume and what not to. If I find something to be offensive in my perspective, I I don't bother. I
Yeah.
don't bother at all. And I feel like a lot of consumers who are entering Tiki, the ones that really care to understand its history, its ties to colonialism, its problems with sexism, racism, etc. I think many of those people will be able to be good consumers and make good choices. So, but again, I can only speak from my experience and kind of tying those decisions that I make to my background and why I make those decisions.
Yeah, I really appreciate you sharing that. I think that's so important to call out, that you don't want to give anyone a reason not to give you any business. It's just a bad business decision at the end of the day to create an inhospitable space in hospitality. Um, and so I really appreciate you sharing that and saying that. And I think we have some great examples of people who are working hard to constantly reevaluate and get it right, especially, King Tiki Jeff Barry. He'll be at Resistance Served. He will attend every session about this stuff, even if it's challenging for him, because he's put so much of his life's work into it. He wants to hear it and he wants to get it right. And I think that can be a great example of leadership to the rest of the community, that, we don't want to harm people, and we want to have everyone be welcome. We don't want to create barriers to our businesses that stop people from, wanting to share hospitality with us. So I really thank you all for your insights. We do have some questions for questions and answered, but I wanted to say first, does anyone feel like they have anything they want to say before we move on to that part? All good? Okay, good, great. I just want to make sure everyone feels heard and feels seen. So value and thank you guys for being here. I also was reminded of the show Little Fires Everywhere, where there's this argument and it goes, you didn't make good choices, you had good choices. And I think understanding that power dynamic, especially from a lot of the people who participated in Tiki culture in a more difficult time, like you said, Angelica, in the 50s, when maybe the hula girl wasn't as understood, or Lindsay, you shared some of the iconic people who participated in sort of some of these shows as gaining popularity and bringing interest. Like, those were the choices they had and they made the most with them. And I think that the onus does not belong on them for participating in this culture. It's the people who controlled the culture and decided to package and create those opportunities. So you guys have been amazing. Thank you for trusting us to share. I think such an important takeaway is, if people don't trust you, they won't share with you. So thank you guys for trusting us today and sharing with us here today. Someone had asked about, there's so much discussion about negative and problematic and potentially offensive portrayals. Does anyone have any examples of representations that you feel were really positive? Is there a way to portray the Polynesian hula girl in a very positive light, or simply is it just, it's not really your thing, you shouldn't be the person doing this? Feel free to chime in. I know, Chalky, yeah, I see your hand. Go for it.
Oh, well, I was reading an article that a friend of mine sent me that was just about how in Hawaii, a lot of times, a lot of the natives would use these shows. They would also create schools to teach their traditions to each other while these things were happening during the mid-century. And I don't have enough knowledge on it because I just started a couple books, but that is like one of the positives that I see that can come out of these things potentially is creating a space to educate the younger generations, especially since with, being a marginalized population, a lot of times with missionaries and everything else, like your traditions and stuff are, beaten and taken away from you and your children are taken away from you. So if things like that can flourish from this, then I feel that that's good.
Yeah, Mariah.
Yeah, I would like to make a distinction, I think, between cultural practitioners like Lindsay, like these amazing hula schools and Heva schools that are, communicating and preserving these cultures and these protocols, as contrasted to, shows that are made for like entertainment purpose or for profit. These are cultures that were actively exterminated. Languages were forbidden, protocols were forbidden, names were forbidden. Children were taken and placed into boarding schools to sort of be very similar to what happened with Native American boarding schools in the continental US. And I think supporting and funding and just like lifting up these cultural institutions as opposed to the plastic dashboard hula girl. Not to say that there's no joy in sharing these cultures, that there isn't things that we can learn in the exchange for culture from these cultures, but to take away the agency of the cultures themselves and not to allow the people that are from these heritages to be in charge, sort of center of the conversation, I think is dangerous. But I see a really nice movement towards centering people of oceanic descent, Pacific Islander descent, Polynesian, Micronesian, Melanesian descent, and that gives me hope and joy, and I'm happy to see that.
Yeah, I was going to ask you, Lindsay, if you would share some thoughts. Yes, please.
I love what everyone's saying, and especially Marina's talking about awareness. I think as a performer, you have a huge responsibility to make people aware through your dance and just your culture. One of the positive things I see out here, and Mariah, you kind of touched on that, is you have these halaus, these families, these groups, and they usually have a leader. And sometimes they don't let you perform on stage unless you go through these protocols in learning the culture. You can't, they actually have levels where you have to consume this knowledge, and if you don't, then you cannot be at the very top. You cannot do the shows. And sometimes these girls, they just sign up because they want to do these shows, they want to get out there and they want to put these beautiful costumes on because it's exciting. But I think it's amazing when you have these group leaders who all they really care about is teaching the culture aspect about it. So I think that's great. And going back to what Mariah said on how Tahitian dance was forbidden because of missionaries. And the reason why we called our competition and cultural event Heva is because that was basically in Tahiti when it started again. When it started again, a lady created the Heva in Tahiti, and it 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 kind of exploded after that, and that was the celebration of culture. So for us, it was extremely important that we recognize that we have the freedom to dance now. We don't have anyone holding us back, and we can evolve. So I think there's a lot of possibilities now that there weren't before. And I think one thing that I see that is, it's kind of rough, but when I see something on YouTube, like somebody somewhere, they're doing something that is just not cultural at all, but they're using costumes, they're saying it's cultural. It's just complete, it's beyond Hollywood, but it's total misinformation. And I usually don't comment on it, but I do see that there are a ton of leaders who actually reach out to them and let them know, you're doing this inappropriately and wrong, please take it down. So I think that it's kind of rough, but I think it's really necessary that those leaders and those people who are really involved in culture, let them know that what they're doing isn't very, I mean, it's inappropriate what they're doing. They're selling a culture that they know nothing about and they have not studied at all. So the awareness, I think, is a huge thing. And yeah, thanks.
I really appreciate how, in the discussion that, well, Tiki isn't meant to be an accurate representation of these cultures. I really appreciate how much you and your mother have shared in interviews and in stories about how it is important to, like, if you're going to represent this culture, get the people who are of this culture to do it correctly and honoring it in an accurate way. And do you have feelings around how that kind of gets brought into Tiki by people, and then it's sort of like, it's like playing a game of telephone, and it moves from what it was culturally to an interpretation that's pretty inauthentic? Do you find that problematic when it's an inauthentic portrayal?
Sort of. We work very hard in bringing Tahitians to our event, just so that we could kind of, I don't want to say uphold our name, but it's authentic, because these people, they really have dedicated their lives to the culture. And so that's why we try to inject them in as much as possible, rather than getting people who they know the culture, but they haven't put as much time or effort. So it's, for us, it's really important that we bring those people in. But sometimes you see things that are just kind of shocking. Like we had an MC, and he was Tahitian, and he was very, very, he dedicated his entire life to learning the culture. Um, and he was gay, and he's very open about his sexuality, and it was extremely, extremely Tahitian. If he was in Tahiti, we loved it, and I loved it. Me and my family sat up there, and we, everything he talked about, he was cultural, he was hilarious, and he was open. Everything that would have been successful in Tahiti, and out here, that kind of backfired on us in a way, and they just kind of tore him apart, just because of I think personalities, and just because maybe I think there's a certain person who's a little bit uptight to feeling all of those emotions in one. But yeah, we've had some backfires in the past couple of years that really have nothing to do with culture and everything to do with politics.
Like you said, what would be successful for the culture in its home is somehow now unacceptable, now that it's been packaged and brought to another place, and that's got to be harmful. I'm sorry that you guys had to experience that.
Yeah, it hurts. It really hurts me whenever I hear comments like that, and they, because these are our they're our clients, and they're our community, and sometimes they're actually leaders in the community who have schools, and so it's kind of like we're walking on a fine line, and we have to be very careful to the politics in America and in Tahiti as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Someone mentions that they heard Mariah's interview on Messy Epicure, which is a podcast resource if you guys are looking for more. And it got them to begin a dialogue with people that they are working with. And they found it was an uphill struggle to get many of them just to even listen to some of the points that were made without writing it all off. And they ask, how do you suggest generating a real dialogue about these issues with those who defend their views? And for me, as a white woman who's always trying to do white person to white person work, I always like to call out, like, the fact that you've been told your whole life that you have great ideas and you're usually right and you don't need to listen to other people and you think you know what's best is privilege. And it's a sign that you need to listen. And so that's like a usual way that I take, and also just saying, well, who should be centered in this discussion? A woman from Ipswich, Massachusetts, who's white and has always lived on the continental US, or these people who have actually lived this. Marina, do you want to share a little bit? Feel free to raise your hands, anyone who wants to comment on this particular question. How do you start this conversation with people?
I'm sorry, there were a lot of details thrown about, and it kind of I got thrown off the.
How do you start a conversation with someone who's really resistant to dealing with like, why are some things problematic and why are some things not? And what's the, like, how do you start that conversation with someone when you're like, hey, this is problematic because, and they just really don't want to hear it or engage with it?
And that's it. I mean, there's really not, other than actually escalating it, I really don't see anything else that could be done. You know, if they're a wall and you're speaking to a wall, you can try to represent and try to be the, you know, the cliche, the better person, and try to do it as diplomatically as possible. But if you're, you know, if you're speaking into a chasm and there's no response and there's nothing that you can do, you just focus your energies elsewhere. It does happen. And you know, I'm from South Florida. People have a very different perception of Polynesian culture here. It's very exotic over here because, you know, the other coast. So they, you know, the term hula hoop girl will come up, and, you know, I'll get the little spasm and try to explain that that's not correct. But I'll do it in a very direct and very respectful way, almost like, you knew that, right? And they'll, oh yeah. And that usually helps. If they're resistant, there's really not much you can do. You can't go down to that level and stay down there. It'll get to you. It'll eat you up. The best thing to do is to stay as stoic and be the best representative you can of what you believe in, and try to stay as diplomatic as possible, just to because you're still representing this culture that you love so much, and you want to keep that dignity, despite the whatever you might get that might sound a little bit, you know, off.
I love that. I'm an Aries, so I'm like, fuck comfort. We're having this out. But Mariah, would you love to chime in on this?
I'm an Aries moon, so I get you. Yeah, I think it's sort of walking a fine line, balancing strength with gentleness, holding space and understanding some of these knee-jerk reactions that will come from folks who feel like they are celebrating, they feel like they're doing a good thing, they're spreading the word about these cultures that they don't necessarily, you know, have personal connection to. And one of the things that I usually try to do when I'm actively having these conversations is I sort of put it upon, or ask them to put it upon themselves, if you would swap out my culture or the family of cultures that this tradition, this genre pulls from, and swap in their own culture. How would you feel about, you know, sexualized representations of your mother, your grandmother, you know, decorating the wall, being half naked, and these environments that are communicating things about these cultures or taking from these cultures in this way, to contrast them with, say, whiteness or Americanness or Western sort of themes and things like that. And I've always, you know, when the conversation or the person I'm speaking to is receptive enough to have a conversation, I usually find that sort of turning it back on themselves and making them think about, you know, their own background, the own things that they're proud of, the people that have raised them and where, you know, they derive their heritage from, is a helpful way to sort of give nuance to a conversation that a lot of people feel is like very black and white, like, yes, no, you can't do this, this is good, this is bad. And I think, you know, we need to, like you said earlier, we need to be able to exist in sort of a shades of gray and nuance, and be comfortable sort of wrestling with these tension-filled sort of topics when it comes to, you know, people, familial relationships, heritage, culture, and imperialism and colonialism, and how that impacts everyone. Yeah, that's what
I appreciate that. Yeah, as soon as like capitalism comes into it, Comrade Chalky, like it gets a little more difficult when that starts to happen. I'm gonna start off this question with Angelica. I'm gonna ask you as a consumer to kick us off here, and then I want to hear each one of your answers to this. So Heidi asks, where are we in discussion as far as renaming Tiki culture to another name in order to be more inclusive of the multicultural embracement, rather than no longer borrowing from the true sacred word Tiki? You want to start with that, Angelica, as a consumer?
Sure. So basically, one of the things that I feel is going on right now is that because Tiki appears to be a very interchangeable term. I find more now than not that I like to refer to it as Polynesian pop, because Polynesian pop is a creation of American pop culture that has Polynesian cultural elements. And that to me is a way for myself to be able to differentiate between the different cultures. Because I mean, just putting everything under a blanket of it's all Polynesian, that, you know, doesn't really do anything either. It just kind of lumps everybody into just one blanket, which I think isn't fair. You know, just through being involved in, you know, and with my community, we have so many wonderful people who are from different, you know, parts of the Pacific Islands. So the whole naming thing is, you know, you can advocate for name changes, but there's going to be some people that are just not going to go for it. And, you know, trying to change people's minds sometimes is, to me, sometimes is folly. We live in such a divided time, you know, where you can start an argument, you know, over just about anything. So as a consumer, I kind of stay away from the whole, oh, we should just like rebrand it, rename it, everything. I think that doing that is going to be very much an uphill battle. And I feel like I prefer to focus on what I can do as an individual versus what, you know, everybody should be doing.
Yeah, I think that's it's interesting. I feel like throughout history, it's always been, we can get in an argument about anything, right? Like, I love reading historical stuff, and it's like, oh my gosh, that royal family have been drama queens forever. You know, we've always kind of had the Crusades, guys, bros, like really, like that's a pretty intense soap opera, guys. But yeah. I hear what you say. I do think that I'm always amazed when I learn different cultural histories, how quickly things can sometimes change. You know, I think we've moved on from using certain words we shouldn't be using anymore. And I think it's happened in some cases more quickly than, you know, maybe we always think. But I really do appreciate like different ideas, different aspects. Chalky, for your Doom Tiki, you do still use the word tiki. And I think it seems like it's integral to it because you were making a statement about tiki. How do you feel about the word tiki versus other options? Should it still be used? How do you feel about it?
I wish that there was a better terminology. I have with my peers that are from these different cultures, there's a certain disrespect and some pain and some exploitation in the conversations that I've had. And I see parallels to being called Indians or savages, or saying that our artwork is primitive, or, you know, kind of.
The word settler, or the word, we talk a lot about these words like settlers and stuff, yeah.
Or pioneer even, and things like that. So it's kind of like a catch-22 for me. If I want people to find me and sit and stay for the conversation, I have to use the terminologies that bring them there, like the word tiki. But, you know, some people don't like what we're doing, and some people have problems with like the satanic rosary we use being disrespectful to their Catholic religion or whatever. But, you know, sometimes that's a chance for dialogue. I mean, I've had lots of guys in our inbox being like, I can't believe you use that the image of the Virgin Mary, like with her tits out. I'm like, why? I mean, I don't see any difference from like what's been going on, you know. But
it's your hula girl turned upside down. Like that's the commentary you're making is, well, if it's okay to do it to these people, why can't you do it to these people?
Yeah, and some of the paintings that I've seen of the Virgin Mary are very Georgia O'Keeffe-esque in certain elements, so to speak. So, you know, it is what it is. But like, you know, if I want people to come and have the conversations, I have to allow the space for them to have a conversation. Even with everybody freaking out about all those far right boogaloo guys co-opting Aloha shirts, when these things happen, I mean, first of all, I got my husband an awesome Antifa Hawaiian shirt because who doesn't like a good fuck you? But, you know, you need to find a commonality and an area that pique somebody's interest if you're going to have these conversations going forward. So if I want you to find me and have these conversations, I'm going to have to use these words, but I'm going to tell you why we're using them. And our policy is, even if we copyright everything and we have all of that going, if it comes to a point where it needs to change, we're going to do that because that's the right thing to do. And it's not my right as an Indigenous woman to not take in the voices of the Pacifica and Oceania and Polynesian communities.
Who would like to speak next? Feel free to raise your hand. All right, Mariah, and then Lindsay, and then Marina. Perfect.
For me, I do wish that we could move past calling these establishments tiki bars, tiki restaurants. I understand that that's going to take some work just because it's an entrenched term that's been in use for a very long time. I disagree with the use of Polynesian pop, mainly because that's a term that was imposed on this massive region of islands and island nations that really only draws out one group we also have Micronesia, which is where my family is from the island of Guam, as well as Melanesia islands like Fiji and Vanuatu and places like that. I feel like defining it even more narrowly when it obviously pulls from a number of different cultures, not only from the Pacific, is somewhat detrimental and even more limiting. And so for me, I would much prefer to use something along the lines of tropical or vacation drinks or something along those lines, because if you are talking about the tropics, that you're not specifically limited to one region. You could dream up experiential, escapist places to go on your mental vacation with your drink that are not necessarily linked to any of these cultures or appropriate any of these cultures in a specific way. But I recognize that this is going to take a lot of work, and it's a slow moving process. But I'm thankful for the work that Chalky's doing, sort of drawing attention to some of the problems and the inconsistencies that are sort of housed within this genre, to sort of highlight and break free from this sort of definition.
Yeah, and I think a lot of the drinks are Caribbean and a lot of the food is Asian.
Yeah.
And I always, whenever I hear like pop, which kind of like pop culture, popular, I'm like, popular to whom? Like,
right.
We always hear about this like rum revival. I'm like, rum revival for whom?
Whom? Yeah.
Pretty sure they've been drinking it in Barbados this whole time.
Right.
Yeah, absolutely. Lindsay, were you next, I think?
Yeah, I was just gonna say, I kind of agree with the term Pacifica pop, only because in my mind, the tiki, the American word, the English word tiki, and the tiki that I know from Tahiti have no correlation at all. The symbols on the tiki are never going to be like the symbols that you see on the tiki in Tahiti. My family in Tahiti, when we were growing up, told me never touch a tiki, never get a tiki tattooed on you because it's taboo and it's sacred. It's supposed to reflect the deities. And at the mare site is basically a traditional place where they used to do sacrifices, burials, and it's almost like a holy place in Tahiti. So that's where the tikis were. And so you have these significations that go beyond anything that the tiki resembles here. So for me, in my mind, my mind just automatically separates the two words completely. So that's why I think I'm okay with something like Pacifica pop, just because it's just no correlation between the two.
Thank you for sharing that. I think that's a really interesting perspective about how you've experienced it firsthand. Thank you. That's something we don't get to hear enough. At Privateer, we have a what's currently called a Tiki Gin, and we've been very clear that next printing we're gonna change it. And a lot of people like the idea of tropical, like you said. Tropical is a great alternative. It doesn't necessarily capture what we're doing, but we'll come up with a better idea. And if we can't come up with a better idea, like, it's kind of our problem. So Marina, how do you feel about the use of the word tiki? Do you see it evolving? Are there any things that you discuss it any differently by?
I think there seems to be many people a big disconnect between Tiki, the actual true meaning of it, and Tiki, the subculture that exists. But because it is derived from that one particular word that seems to get people right, right in the feels, whether it be positive or negative, and knowing that the entire subculture was based on things beyond, much like what Mariah was saying, beyond just the Polynesian Triangle. This is stuff that's derived from many, many different places. There's influences from Japan, there's influences from China, the Caribbean, all these things. It is a tropical, it's definitely the tropical foundation of what this subculture has become. So I have no doubt that the human brain is capable of coming up with a really great alternative at some point. But yes, it will be a slow progression, because so many people are already, it's in their gray matter. They know this term, and it's going to be hard to just snap out of that term and not say it otherwise. But you do hear it being expressed differently lately. I actually do see a bit of a shift. And when you see restaurants opening up, they don't necessarily have Tiki on the titles so much. They may be still enabling you to have an escapist opportunity by going inside and experiencing, something that they would consider a tropical paradise. But it doesn't necessarily have to have Tiki in the title, but it is going to be a bit of a process. I had worked at the Maikai for a certain period of time, and that was never called a Tiki restaurant. To me, that was called the Maikai. You go to the Maikai and experience that, and I think as places begin to develop their identity as little escapist worlds, maybe they can come up with a more acceptable term, but it's going to take some thinking. I'm going to hit some universities, some wordsmiths, and see if we can come up with something clever.
Yeah. That reminds me of a bar here in Boston called Shore Leave that works really, really hard to experience a tropical escape without the expense of using some of this representative images that can be really harmful, and just a really thoughtful way to approach and deal with it. And I mean, that was years ago. They were like very ahead of it, and I'm very proud of them. So I think I've got two more questions I want to ask you guys, if that's okay. One is, do you think there's a good way to subvert these images to create something that could potentially show consumers of Tiki who are unaware or how harmful or dismissive these images are? And I think that speaks a little bit to Chalky's work, but do you guys find ways that you can highlight like really positive sort of images, or point out in really effective ways how these images are harmful? Anyone want to take that one? All right, I see Mariah kind of, yeah. Please do. We don't get to hear your voice enough.
I think, it's difficult, right? Because you have to have someone that's willing to do the work, willing to look past, willing to, read or, look at work from Indigenous artists. I think that Instagram is a really great resource. If you'd like to look at, there's a number of really great Indigenous Pacifica women photographers that are documenting, what womanhood looks like, what families look like in these islands, in the diaspora. So it really, I don't know how you could promote that necessarily in places alongside imagery that's a little bit more reductive or dismissive or stereotypical. That's difficult. So I would say you've got to, people have got to take it on themselves, and because people will have to take it on themselves, the process is going to be even slower. But yeah, there's some great folks out there, some great artists that you should seek out and follow.
Yeah, diversify your feed.
Yeah.
Follow different accounts that show you different images of the world, different types of womanhood, different types of expressions through these different cultures. I know that your website has a great reading list, so I will steer people there. Okay. Last question from one of my favorite Tiki bartenders says, as a young girl, I often saw myself in these hypersexualized hula girl images. And as Mariah mentioned, that's largely because I was seeking any kind of representation, and that was the closest I would ever see. Until we can really see better representations of our culture, what advice would you give to a young woman or mother, or like me, an auntie of young women, in order to help them better understand they don't need to subscribe to the island girl imagery? Mariah, will you kick us off?
I'm also an auntie. I'm a tia. I think it starts with our, within our own communities and the women, the girls around us, and really supporting and showing them alternatives. You hear a lot of the time, you should act as the person that you wish you had when you were younger. And so I feel also a lot of the activism and the things that I talk about are really, I'm like speaking to myself when I was, a teenager, trying to figure out like, what does this mean? I'm multiracial. I don't know, what does culture and the society think about me at large? And I would just hope that these conversations can kind of be ongoing and spread throughout the diaspora, throughout community, but also to women in general, because I don't think that, hypersexualized images of women are limited specifically to this community. That's something that we're all dealing with in all of our families and neighborhoods and countries. So it's a smaller part of this larger conversation that I think is gaining more momentum as of late. And I just can't wait to see more of that happen and sort of cross-pollinate and lift up these voices in terms of womanhood and femininity.
Great. Anyone else want to raise their hand for this one? Chalky?
I just think it's really important to create mentorships and to find women in your community, or even ones that aren't, and kind of show them all the things that you wish that someone had shared with you. And I mean, like in our community, when I was, growing up, like, you go through certain changes, the elders talk to you and things like that. And I think that's something that we're missing as a society, particularly in America, because we don't have that like wisdom and, that shared sort of like journey through womanhood that's, honored in the same way. And I think it's important to kind of find a modern way to recreate that, and a modern way to help lift up other women and empower them. So that's just kind of my viewpoint on it.
Anyone else want to chime in? Yeah, Marina.
I do think it's very important to set a good example. And even if you are dealt the cards that you are dealt, you can do quite a bit with them. It's just a matter of ingenuity. I was the only female pilot in this one particular flight school, and it was the last person that they would expect coming into this, this little academy. And here I am, this little brown girl going, hey, I'm flying. But it made other people realize that they could fly too, and doing things that you wouldn't think you were capable of shows others that they can do it as well. And, test yourself. And do be the example. Do really that you guys pegged it. Be the person you wish you could meet, really. And if you can do that, and you can set someone in the right direction, that's brilliant. And because you're still that small girl looking at yourself. It's not hard to look in the mirror and see yourself as a 12-year-old, as a 9-year-old, as a 5-year-old, and go, holy mackerel, you did that. I think it would be great to continue to set that example and keep that strong sensibility that there is, not that you can do every single thing, but boy, you can do a heck of a lot. I mean, you've only got so much time, right? Let's take that moment and grab it with both fists really hard and go. That sounded weird.
I love it. I love it. I think it's great. I think it's great.
But really, that's it. Just if you see something that you really think would really be remarkable, not just for you as an individual, but for you as, historically in you, if it's something that you really think you should try or achieve, or at least attempt, my goodness, do it, because someone's watching and taking notes, and those are the shoulders that will provide the lift for the next person. So
yeah. And Lindsay, I can't even imagine your work with dance, working with, younger people and getting them like in their bodies and expressing themselves and feeling powerful. It seems like this is probably something you're doing a lot of.
Yeah, and there's something very sensual about dance, and it's kind of crazy seeing these young dancers evolve into women, right? Because I've been doing this for 10 years, so I literally see them as little babies, little tikis, and then now I see them very sensual and just expressing themselves in ways that just kind of shocks me. So it's really amazing to kind of see them find themselves, I guess. What surprises me is that in Tahiti, the dance is actually becoming more sexualized. So it's kind of hard for me to say what's the right way and what's the wrong way, because I kind of go off what's happening in Tahiti, and it's becoming more creative, more sexual in their dance movements. So it's really hard for me to tell people that this is wrong and this is right and this is too sexual, because I'm just looking at the evolution that's happening in Tahiti. And if we're going off of that and we're trying to learn and adapt to how they are, it's getting more sexual out there. So it's a fine line between what's happening out here and what's happening out there, and how much of it we can really consume. But I agree with you guys 100% on, being a good role model, and, trying to think about who you want to be as a person. And there are little kids watching us. There's little girls who are kind of wanting to be us in this role. So I agree with you guys.
Angelica, do you have anything you want to add to the end?
Sure. So first of all, I absolutely love what Marina said. I think it's very important to be a good example. I'm so incredibly fortunate that I had my mother to be an example for me, to be a strong, woman of color, to take advantage of the fact that I was given a brain to think, and to make decisions according to how I feel, that it's important to be an individual above all other things. I am a part of a Mexican culture. I have a community, but more than anything, it's important to value yourself as an individual, value your thoughts, your way of processing things, and always know that there's an opportunity to always learn, even if you don't agree. That doesn't have to be a detriment. That doesn't have to stop you. So yeah, I'm very grateful for my own experience, and I think this was a really good discussion, and I'm grateful for all the viewpoints.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that really personal perspective. I appreciate it. Thank you to all our guests who have stayed with us through the long haul for this really important discussion. Thank you, panelists, for sharing so much of your personal experience and perspective. We will all act respectfully and use a consent-based approach if we're reaching out to you for any follow-up, and we will go and do our own research and not treat you like our own personal Google. And Phoenix, if you could take us away, that would be wonderful. Thank you.
Absolutely. Maggie, thank you so much for being an amazing moderator and for guiding the conversation today. And thank you again to all the panelists for sharing your perspectives. We truly appreciate your time and your energy. And to all of our audience members, if you enjoyed today's discussion, this will be a monthly series, and we invite you to join us next month as we will feature Mariah Kunkel from Pacifica Project and in Intoxicating Flavors of Colonization, second Sunday of the month at 11 a.m. to 12:30 p.m. Pacific time. Thank you all.